Hugging the Pacific on Canada's southwest corner, Vancouver no doubt serves as a gateway for the Great White North's desire to be an important player in the Asia-Pacific. This week, foreign ministers from various nations, including Canada, Japan, South Korea, and the U.S. convened in Vancouver to discuss peace and security issues on the Korean peninsula. But ahead of the conference, China and Russia's absence from the list of guests raised questions as to how effective the meeting might be. As former Canadian Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs Len Edwards argued, the omission creates two dilemmas. It potentially sends a message that Beijing and Moscow's adversaries from the days of the 1950 to 1953 conflict in Korea are gathering to determine the fate of the peninsula, a point echoed by Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, and that it will be difficult to enlist the PRC and Russian Federation's assistance in multilateral talks on the Korean crisis in the future. Multilateral diplomacy over the North Korean crisis has long constituted an unofficial yet obvious grouping of China, North Korea, Russia on the one side, and a Japan-South Korea-U.S. partnership on the other. Ottawa, a staunch American ally, has now entered the fold, seemingly casting its lot with Washington and other U.S. allies in Northeast Asia. Canada's entry into the interplay of regional diplomacy raises the specter of greater Canadian involvement in Korean affairs. It will be difficult to enlist the PRC and Russian Federation's assistance in multilateral talks on the Korean crisis in the future. Ottawa has long prided itself on being a U.S. partner that nevertheless pursues its own path in international affairs. In particular, it has generally emphasized diplomacy over military action. Although Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's election victory in 2015 came in response, as Tina Jilwan Park and Benoit Hardy-Chartrand argue, to Canada's diminished global influence under the preceding premiership of Stephen Harper, Trudeau seems to be earnestly committed to continuing the policies of his predecessor in emphasizing Canada's Asia-Pacific policies, such as Harper's emphasis on thawing relations with China after a period of coolness under his government. Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov has condemned Russia's exclusion. Photo, State Department left outside alone. The Kremlin has made no bones about condemning the Vancouver meeting as harmful, and slammed the fact that Russian representatives would only receive information about the proceedings after their conclusion. Lavrov also dismissed claims that Russia had been informed ahead of time about the meeting agenda as false. Critiques of China and Russia's exclusion from the proceedings in Vancouver are not without merit. Yet a deeper level of analysis is pertinent beyond the problem Beijing and Moscow's exclusion. To understand Canada's policy undertakings in regards to Korean affairs, the role of the Russian Federation in Northeast Asian regional diplomacy offers some insights into the potential course of Canadian policy. Although Canada has waded into the fray of Korean security discussions, one single meeting does not mean that Ottawa has established itself as a credible player in Northeast Asia in the long term. If Canada is seriously interested in playing a formidable role in the Korean crisis, it has a long road ahead of it to establish itself in this regard. One only need look at Russia and its role in the diplomacy over the Korean Peninsula crisis to understand this. For Moscow not to blast its exclusion from the Vancouver Conference would indeed be strange. Yet one cannot fault Canada entirely for working more closely with the U.S. and its allies in the context of Korean affairs. Canada, like Russia, has relatively little influence in and of itself as an actor in Northeast Asia. The Kremlin has made no bones about condemning the Vancouver meeting as harmful, even though Ottawa's foreign strategy has placed much more emphasis on multilateral diplomacy than the US's. There comes a point where Canada is essentially forced to take sides. As much as it may wish to serve as an intermediary between opposing sides of the diplomatic contention over Korea, Canada cannot both serve as a neutral intermediary while simultaneously asserting itself as a viable player in Northeast Asia. Indeed, Russia has sought to engage in this very game. Throughout 2017, Russia's profile as a player in the Korean crisis gained increased traction, particularly in light of the cooling of Beijing-Pyongyang relations. More recently, Russian Ambassador-at-Large Oleg Burmistrov has insinuated that the Russian Federation is willing to serve as an intermediary for direct talks between North Korea and the U.S. given Moscow's deep-seated apprehensions about U.S.-led military action against the DPRK. The Russian government would doubtlessly be more than willing to do anything necessary to prevent that. Recent months have seen Russia push to serve as an intermediary between Pyongyang and Washington. Photo, Rodong Sinman stuck in the middle. Yet given the recent rise in DPRK-Russia relations, compounded by the historic albeit uneven and problematic relationship between North Korea and the USSR, officials from Washington would hardly consider talks in Moscow to be a neutral territory. Of course, Canada's decision not to invite Chinese or Russian officials does not mean that Ottawa ostensibly, at least, doesn't value China and Russia's cooperation on the Korean security crisis. Indeed, Justin Trudeau has commented that, even without inviting representatives from Beijing and Moscow, we will continue the ongoing dialogue with all partners, including countries like Russia and China, who absolutely will play an important role in moving towards peace on the Korean peninsula. Prime Minister Trudeau's coupling of China and Russia in his comments underscores another dynamic in the criticism of Beijing and Moscow's exclusion from the Vancouver summit. One can only wonder at how much criticism outside Moscow would emerge if only Russia were excluded, but China allowed to participate. Russia, a recognized great power that not only borders North Korea but has a long-standing relationship with the country, has long been considered all but an associate of China in inter-Korean diplomatic discussions. In and of itself, Moscow has never been considered an indispensable actor in what Russians often call the Korean knot. Russia was notably absent from a Track 1.5 meeting in Sweden last year covering the Korea crisis. To be sure, a Track 1.5 meeting doesn't carry nearly the same weight as an official, government-level meeting. Yet there is no doubt that if China had been excluded from the summit in Stockholm last year, it would have raised considerably more eyebrows. Whether discussing Russia's position on sanctions at the UN Security Council, or the Kremlin's positions on various US-led missile defense initiatives in Northeast Asia, the Russian Federation rarely receives consideration in terms of its role in wider Northeast Asian dynamics without some sort of association with China. Yet Moscow at this point has essentially no choice but to work on some level in concert with Beijing in regional diplomacy. Certainly Moscow would prefer to enjoy, and receive, consideration from the international community as a force to be reckoned with in Korean peninsula diplomacy. Edited by Oliver Hutham. Featured image, Kremlin.ru.